Hello, it's Colonel Gallagher again, and I'm here to tell you about the French and Indian War. And I'm going to try to do it within 10 minutes, which is going to be a challenge. French and Indian War, the way I'd kind of start, and I'm going to start, is this instrument right here has been said to be more powerful than the sword. And what's interesting in this story is this instrument right here, the pen, is the reason for this story. One historian named Francis Parkman wrote about the French and Indian War and stated that with the scratch of a pen, the continent shifted hands in an instant. And in that instant, the burdens of an empire shifted upon the shoulders of the British. The French and Indian War went from 1754 to 1763. It had two names, as all the other wars, three other wars that the French and the British fought each other. Every war that they fought during these late 1600s into the 1700s had two names to it. But the French and Indian War that the French and the English fought was very unique for a couple of reasons, but one of them was the fact that this war between the French and the English began in the colonies, the American colonies. It had to do with a region known as the Ohio Valley. The French had about 65,000 total people in the colonies, the American colonies, a very small group of settlers. And the English had about 1.5 million, most of them clinging to the Atlantic coast, but they had both started moving, the French to the south, the English to the west, converging in this area known as the Ohio River Valley. In the middle of it all, to make it more complicated, were the Native Americans. And the one group that you really need to read about is a group called the Six Nations, led by a group called the Iroquois. It's from the neck of the woods I grew up in New York. And the Iroquois and the Six Nations had fashioned a treaty with the English. And in doing so, once again with a stroke of a pen, had shifted the Ohio Valley, ceding huge amounts of land to the English. And in doing so, a group of very adventurous speculators, people who wanted to buy the land and make it useful in the Ohio Valley, decided to start selling parcels of it. This became known as the Ohio Valley Company. George Washington would be a member of this. And so, in doing this, the French wanted and made claim to this land. It created this conflict. And so, the French and Indian War grew out of it. However, with the French and Indian War, the other way to look at it in England and in France and in Europe is it was known as the Seven Years' War because 1756, be about 2 years later that it would start with them. And it was, as one historian, Carl Degler, had said, it was the global war for empire. It's the first real global war for empire because the French and English were fighting each other in this 1754 to 1763 like span of time. What was on the table is kind of like a big poker game. All chips were in, basically. Whoever won would not only get the colonies, which would be this shift of this enormous burden to the British, but India, several islands in the Caribbean, major ports around the world. That's what was at stake. And so it was big stakes. And in the middle of this all are the Native Americans. So for American history, it's very important to understand this. And it's a different type of warfare. The British are going to learn some things here in the French and Indian War. The French and Indian War is really in three phases. I break it into three phases. The first one is 1754 to 1756. This is I call it the British losing phase. The British didn't do very well. Initially, one of their greatest generals, Sir Edward Braddock, is killed on his way to Fort Duquesne. This is where Fort Pitt would later on be founded, which would be Pittsburgh, my people. Good old Pittsburgh Steelers or Pittsburgh Penguins. And so this is the loss of several key leaders. The British aren't doing so well because the way the war is being fought is a little different. The French and the Indians, despite the idea that the French were less in numbers, have chosen a guerrilla type warfare. And the English are very accommodating by moving down these trails in these large forested areas and being ambushed, as Edward Braddock was. In the middle of this are the colonials. And young George Washington, he's 22 years old, is a lieutenant colonel eventually, and ends up getting his first taste of actual combat. And the book to read is The Crucible of War by Fred Anderson. It's an older book, but it's still the best. And in the very beginning, there's this wonderful description of the type of warfare. And let me just read a little bit to you. I know it's probably not the rain had fallen all night, a steady, miserable rain, and when at last the light grew to the point that he could see his troops, George Washington realized that 7 of them were lost in the forest. God knew where. I could go on. It's an excellent beginning. And it shows all the difficulties with Washington working with Native American allies, working against the French and their Native American allies. And so it's a very complex situation. To the French and the English, it is about a global empire. But to the Native Americans, it's about pure survival. Okay, most of the Native Americans, the Indians, would side with the French because they're less in numbers. They're not inhabiting the land. They're not trying to speculate the land. And the French had done miraculously in controlling that region where the Louisiana region would be called, which is along the Mississippi River, which runs right up to where you have the Ohio Valley. And so there's a whole lot at stake here. Now, the second phase, after the British aren't doing too well, is 1756 to 1758, the second stage, we call it. And in that second stage, there's a leadership change. And the British end up setting their sights on a man, giving him responsibility to oversee the entire war, a man named Sir William Pitt, P-I-T. And Pitt is probably the least likely man. He's kind of frail. He's not a guy that would be someone you'd put on a great horse and have him ride around, try to inspire the men. But he's brilliant. He's a wonderful organizer. And Pitt then selected 3 good commanding officers and put them to work. And I'm not worried about you knowing all of them. One would be one of them would be Jeffrey Amherst, excuse me, Sir Jeffrey Amherst. Okay, another one would be last name Wolfe, James Wolfe. Okay, and these guys would go about and start to shift the way the war was fought. Amherst would take this very strong port city of Louisburg, and then you'd have Wolfe, who would have the famous victory outside Quebec, up in Montreal, and this began to spell the end of the French. And so the transition period is 1756-58 for the leadership, but from 58, the third stage, 1758 to 1763 is the defeat of the French at these strategic locations. And what eventually happened is the French eventually would surrender and they would sign the Treaty of Paris of 1763, because there's only how many Treaty of Paris. The Treaty of Paris 1763, in a stroke of a pen, ceded large amounts of the globe to the British. Now, leads to a question. Can winners be losers? Does victory create new problems? All you have to do is ask Americans. Yes. Once the Americans won World War II, everyone went, so, whew, it's over with. That's good. Instead, the Americans, ever since the end of World War II, have become, quote unquote, the leaders of the free world. We're Atlas. We put the globe on our back. And we have to now deal with this. It created a new relationship between the British and the colonials. The British, as one historian said, went about trying to figure out what their new policy would be, their new imperial policy towards this larger empire. Plus, the second thing is important. It's not just have to govern a large empire. The British are in massive debt. This is the fourth in a string of wars in about 100 years, and the British are now in debt. War costs a lot of money. Once again, ask an American. And so we just finished supposedly with Afghanistan, longest war ever in American history. Prior to Afghanistan, we had Iraq, and prior to that, we had what used to be the longest war in American history, Vietnam. And we're all trying to make the world a better place, aren't we now? Maybe we didn't learn from the British in this. And anyway, the British now, this new imperial policy, decided because of the need for revenue, the need for the debt, those colonials should pay their share. After all, 1754, the war began in that region, for the Ohio Valley. And aren't they not subjects of the king in the realm? Yes. The problem is not that they're going to be taxed. The problem to the colonials is simple. You cannot tax us without our consent. No taxation without actual representation. Don't say actual representation. The British changed this relationship. The reaction by the Native Americans and the colonials are in sync with each other. By the way, the Native Americans, don't forget them. They reacted. A man named Pontiac formed a large Indian confederacy, because at the end of the war, the colonials thought this war was fought to get the Ohio Valley, and Pontiac said, "Oh, not so fast, my friends." And so it created this problem that the British solved by creating this thing called the Proclamation Line of 1763, which stopped further Western advancements. The British had a garrison in this area, and you know, anytime you hear the word garrison, that means military. Anytime you hear the word military, that means money. And so money, men, and military all go together. And so here we go with a new stage, the American Revolution. The American Revolution, you can simply start it from 1760, in my book 1763, when the British decided to change the imperial policy, take a little bit better notice of those colonials over there and begin to regulate them more. You guys should know this, you're teenagers. Once you get to this stage, you want a lot more freedom and independence. You want to exercise that. For a long time, let's say your parents have kind of ignored you. Now all of a sudden they take deeper interest in you. And they want to regulate your affairs more. This is kind of like the American Revolution. And I know my timer, I'm a little bit past, but I wanted to leave this with you that revolution is really a process, not an event. And the American Revolution from 1760 or 1763 up into 1775, the next 15 years, the Americans and the British are going to argue about representation. It must be important, and it is. It still is today. And so the Americans are always going to stick to the credo of no taxation without actual representation. And we'll save that for another time. Okay? So in this cause, effect, cause synopsis of history called the French and Indian War, it is important, and you should know it. Okay? Thank you. You have questions, let me know. Bye-bye.